So today we'll be focusing on education and states and localities, get through that, and talk a little bit about some of the elements that are involved in it, some of the recent or more recent sort of controversies and issues of that type. So public education, when we talk about public education, it means government-run schools. So the education system that's provided by the state or by the government and generally has to follow its rules. Now, there are private schools as well, something that we'll be talking about, and then we'll be coming up with some importance later. But for the most part, we're focused on public education, and most students in the United States go through public education. So this is long-standing. So textbook notes, the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, putting up elements dealing with education. So this is something that's been focused on since basically the beginning. Now, having said that, especially the public school system we know today, really starts to develop fully in the late 1800s, early 1900s, going forward to today. Now, with that, one of the big reasons for this is, well, obviously there's a focus on public education because you want to have a citizenry that is technically competent and intelligent, so you have an educated citizenry to increase economic growth. It's not just that, and this is especially important for a democracy, constitutional republic, whatever term you want to use. But a big part of public education is to focus on civic education. So especially if you're dealing with a large country like the United States, especially a rather heterogeneous one, the idea is you want to have some type of commonality or unity among people. And civic education being part of that, being potentially a very big part of it. Something that people can say, okay, what keeps us together? What unites us? What are the things that makes us citizens? And then additionally, the idea being that you want educated citizens to have to create a better tomorrow, create a better state. This is also why it becomes controversial. So what does better mean? So do you focus especially on math and science, or do you focus on things like social justice and social activism? What would be the balance between these things? What is the perspective one presents on, say, American history or certain sort of major American figures or things of that type? Dealing with religion, how does that play into it? Additionally, say if there are differences, well, there are differences between people inside the country. How do you address those? How do you describe them? How do you discuss them? Things of that type. Now, briefly, you already mentioned this inside the local government lecture. Schools tend to be decentralized. So you have thousands of school districts across the United States. Now, with that in mind, you still have state controls, especially with something like the State Department of Education or something like that, that sets certain standards, as well as has influence because of being able to basically spend money or give money to school districts. The national government has gotten more involved as time has gone on, but it's comparatively recent. So the Department of Education at the national level, that only came into existence in the late 1970s, so comparatively pretty recent. Once again, school districts run by a school board and that handles policy, and the school superintendent is the one who is dealing with day-to-day operations. Keeping in mind that this decentralization, one of the big reasons for it, especially initially, was that given the size of the United States and the differences that existed there, the notion was that a one-size-fits-all type of education system really wasn't practical or wise. So for instance, if we're looking at like the late 1800s or earlier, the kind of education that, say, children living inside a fishing village on the coast of Maine would need is probably going to be rather different than, say, the kind of education people living in the Great Plains in Oklahoma would need. Or even within one state. So if we look at something like the state of Pennsylvania, children being raised inside a community that's mostly focused on farming are probably going to have different educational needs than, say, children being raised in a village that's involved with mining or with manufacture or something of that type. This is one of the big reasons for the decentralization through school districts, is that the particular needs for any given community can vary pretty substantially. Now, obviously, as America has developed, as the technology for transportation and communication has developed, there's been a little more standardization, obviously. But even with that said, I should say also with that standardization, you see also more national involvement. But even with that, the notion is that local communities do have different norms, different needs, and so forth, too, which makes having this kind of decentralization wise, or at least useful. Now, one of the biggest variations between states or even districts is funding. We kind of mentioned that before in terms of the amount of funding any given school district might have. Now, the national average roundabout per student going through the public education system is about $12,600 per year is being spent on per student across the US. Now, having said that, there's a great deal of variation. So some states will spend maybe about $7,000. Other states, like New York, spend almost double that amount. And this can reflect a lot of different factors. So one of the big ones being the general economic wealth of the state. So a state like New York, very wealthy state, is probably going to be able to spend more money than a state like South Dakota. Similarly, the strength of teachers unions, which might be able to move more funding towards schools and so forth, what type of structures exist for funding within a given state, and things of that type. One thing to note, though, is that the amount of money that's being spent per pupil doesn't necessarily equate to better educational outputs. So output being just, say, a measure of whether things are working. So one of the big examples of this would be SAT scores. So SATs being the main test that's usually used for students who want to go on to college. And while this has changed somewhat in the last couple of years, one of the main measures for being able to get to a college or to be able to get funding for a college education and so forth is based on SAT scores. So the higher, the better. A state like New York is a good example. So New York spends more than any other state in the union on education. So it spends about $24,000 per pupil. But in terms of SAT scores, it ranks 39th out of 50. So pretty low. Having said that, there can be a lot of factors with this. So it can be a factor of, say, more students taking the test in New York than, say, in like Vermont or South Dakota. Could also reflect certain issues about, say, differences in socioeconomic status, things of that type. Even controlling for all of that, though, higher or lower funding doesn't necessarily seem to reflect in things like, say, better or lower test scores, in at least a clear-cut way. Now, funding, obviously, is an issue that comes up. So we've already mentioned a little bit inside local government. We also mentioned when talking about the Texas State Constitution and the right of education, that one of the big concerns is the differences in funding between schools, and this can lead to some pretty significant inequalities. So again, kind of concerned that a vicious circle can form. So you have a poor community. They can't spend as much money on education, property taxes, and so forth. They're not able to collect as much. The idea being that the schools will tend to be lower quality, which means the students who graduate from them, if they graduate at all, generally aren't going to be able to be as upwardly mobile economically or socially, which tends to mean that that school, that general area is going to get poorer. If it's getting poorer, that means even less money to the schools. And then most likely the quality will go down even further, going again in this sort of circle. So this is the reason why in some places like California and Texas, the state courts have said, okay, more centralized form of school funding is necessary to, even if you can't get rid of these funding inequalities, at least try and mitigate them somewhat. Now, having said that, there are some other issues that can come up with funding. So for instance, individuals or couples who don't have children, and especially those who don't plan on having children or maybe are incapable of having children, sometimes argue that paying taxation for education is unfair. They're basically paying for something for which they get no benefit. Now, usually the response to this being, well, we are educating the next generation of citizens, so even if there's not a direct benefit, there's an indirect one for these people. The one that tends to be more of an issue is parents who are sending their children to other schools, private schools, and especially religious schools. So for many parents, they say they'd like their children to be raised in they'd like children to get not just, say, regular education, but also education that has a religious content to it. So Protestant schools, Catholic schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools, what have you. Their concern tends to be that, in effect, they're having to pay double, that they're paying for their own child's education. So effectively, the school district is spared having to spend money on that pupil because the pupil is not in the public school, that child isn't in the public school system. The parents are paying for their education on their own. and yet they're still paying taxes for a public education system they're not using. This can cause some tensions. In some areas where you do have funding that can go to religious schools, and we'll be talking about this, they're called education vouchers, something we'll talk about in a few minutes, then a different kind of controversy arises. So if parents can use money to send their kids to a Catholic school or to a Jewish school or what have you, there's a question about whether this violates the No Establishment Clause of the US Constitution, specifically the First Amendment. So the No Establishment Clause says that the state and the country can't have an officially recognized religion. But as this has gone through, say, the courts, it means more than just that, it means more than saying that the state of New Hampshire can't declare itself a Baptist state. It can also mean things like if say religious organizations are getting money from the state, is this sort of at least indicating support of that religion or that specific denomination by the state? Especially with that can become something that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause. So the question being, is this something that's going on with that as well? One of the particular controversial issues, especially the last 20, 30 years, has been the issue of measurement. So it's kind of easy to measure inputs into a school. How much money is a school getting? How many new computers does a school have? How many new teachers have been hired? Things of that type. Outputs, on the other hand, can be a little more difficult. So what are we getting out of it? So again, the SAT scores tend to be something that's used. Graduation rates, certain tests on literacy or math ability are also ones that can be used. So one of the reflections of this was, say, in the early 2000s, under the George W. Bush administration as president, there was a national bill called the No Child Left Behind Act, which tried to do testing not only at the high school level, but also at lower levels to try and measure outputs. Now, one of the controversies with this was the idea that this basically encouraged teachers to teach to the test rather than to do teaching. That because funding could be connected with, say, the outputs in this case, teachers are kind of focused on trying to make sure students do really well with tests without necessarily being concerned about if they're learning terribly much. Discussions of measurement on outputs is where you see some of the more tense arguments that can occur, especially between teachers' unions on the one hand and various sort of taxpayer groups on the other. And so we'll deal with each in turn. Now, for teachers' unions, their view tends to be that strict measurements are unwise. They don't make sense. One of the big things being that, okay, for a teacher, you're going to be covering a lot of things. Yes, you're covering reading. Yes, you're covering writing. Yes, you're covering mathematics. Yes, you're covering science. Great. But you're also covering many other sort of things. You're covering history. You're covering civics, trying to make the citizens of tomorrow. Trying to encourage toleration, trying to increase social integration. So even things for like smaller children, teaching them how to share and how to do so. Things that you really can't measure terribly well. So for something like social integration, so helping children to be able to better interact with their peers and with others. How are you going to measure that? And more to the point, how are you going to measure that across the entire country rather than just in, say, one district or in one state? Even social psychologists would probably find that to be pretty challenging to try and figure out some sort of measurement that would be valid for something like that. Additionally, one of the things I'll note is that according to many studies, one of the biggest factors that drives whether a student does well or does poorly is based on their home environment. So if their parents are involved, if their parents are supportive, if their parents are together, this tends to increase the achievement of a student. Meanwhile, if, say, it's a broken home, or if the parents just don't care, or things like that, then achievement's going to go down. So the idea would be that you could be the best teacher in the world, but if your students are all coming from homes where the parents just don't care, the chances are you're not going to be able to do much. So the idea is this kind of measurement isn't really measuring teachers, and it would be unfair to hold them to that kind of standard. Taxpayer groups, on the other hand, say that measurement is pretty necessary. And they say this is especially necessary because teachers' unions especially, and schools, tend to constantly be wanting to ask for increases in funding, whether it's for teacher salaries, whether it's for infrastructure, or whatever else. They're usually asking for more. Very rarely does a school or a teachers' union say, no, we're good, we don't need more money. But then again, Rarely anyone does that, really. The idea for the taxpayer groups is saying, okay, well, if you keep wanting more money, we have to see if it's actually succeeding. If we have schools or teachers where we have students who aren't able to do well, so again, if you have students who are getting through all the way to high school and are functionally illiterate or can't even do basic multiplication tables, the idea is, okay, sending more money is just sending good money after bad, that we're not helping anything. If we're constantly basically we're creating a negative incentive system if people can basically not, if teachers or schools can basically graduate students who are incapable of basic skills and then giving them more money, it doesn't make sense. So under this view, the idea is that teachers are just like anyone else, that you're going to have to measure their success or failure, that measurement is a necessary requirement. Now, one of the other things that makes things controversial is what should be taught in schools. So for instance, part of this is just dealing with details. So pretty much everyone says that yes, math and science are good things that students should learn. Students should also have a good, ability to read and write. Nice. But what does that mean in practice? What does that mean in detail? How much time or emphasis should be spent on one versus another? What is considered an adequate level of, say, math education? What's considered an adequate level of reading skill? Things of that type. And how much, given that you have a limited amount of time in any given day to be able to teach students, how much time should be spent on this? What kind of effort or emphasis should there be? But also in terms of what exactly one's aiming for students to do. So should there be tracks for different types of students? So for instance, thinking back to when I was in high school, I and many of my friends, our idea was, okay, after we finish high school, we're aiming to try and get into college. But we also had many friends who said, well, no, after high school, I want to go into the skilled trades. I want to become a mechanic, or I want to become an electrician or a plumber, or something like that. So the idea being, so should high schools just focus on those who are going to be trying to go to college, or should they have, say, classes available as sort of pre-vocational training for those who want to go into the skilled trades? What should that balance be? And then how would you determine which students go where, in fact? Some of the more major debates, though, touch on issues surrounding morals and identity. So again, the idea is that education is trying to make educated citizens of tomorrow. Nice. But again, if you're dealing with a rather diverse and heterogeneous population, you're going to have some pretty significant differences in opinion on what exactly that entails. So if we're looking over the last 100 years, one of the big ones that comes up frequently is sexual morality. So especially things like sex education. So if there's sex education in schools, so typically for adolescents, although it seems like it's getting a lot earlier now. So it seems they're starting even like age 8 or 9 rather than at like 10 or 12. If there's going to be, so the first question, should schools be involved in sex education or should they not? Though over time, effectively, the answer has generally become yes, they should. But then also what should be taught? So for instance, should students be taught that abstinence is preferable, so that there should be no sort of sexual activity until you're married? Or should there be an emphasis on birth control and say health matters to try and avoid sexually transmitted diseases or something of that type? Should there be more of a focus on traditional sort of gender norms and that sort of thing, or should there be more of a focus on transgenderism, homosexuality, LGBTQ, and other sorts of newer types of sexual morality or types of sexual identity? Because again, especially if you're dealing with different political ideologies, different religious beliefs and so forth, that's a controversial area. And in particular, the idea being that because students are getting this from school, parents could quite reasonably say, okay, we don't want our children to be learning something that's in significant variance from our own beliefs. This can also come into identity, and especially history. So again, if we're raising citizens of the future citizens of the country, what should their view of the country be? So something like the 1619 Project is an example. So this controversy has been going on for a while, but especially about the last year and a half, 2 years, this has come up more frequently. So the 1619 project is something that schools have started using. It tends to focus American history on, say, the development of slavery and how it's shaped much of how American society has existed since that time and how it's affected things like systemic racism and things of that type. Versus, say, views that would say, okay, well, the history should focus on, say, the United States as being one of the first examples of a country that tried to base itself on natural rights and on freedom and liberty and that sort of thing. The reason why this tends to be so tense is because even with the ancient Greeks, I think it was the philosopher Aristotle who noted that people tend to learn best what they learn first. So those initial lessons that you're going to get as a child are probably going to shape, even at a subconscious or an unconscious level, how you view things from that point forward. You're not even necessarily thinking about it. It's just, it almost seems like sort of second nature or common sense to you because it's just the first thing you learn when you were very young. So let's say as a comparison, so if we're looking at, say, a previous historical figure and how that person is viewed. Let's take someone like Thomas Jefferson as an example. So Thomas Jefferson, one of the main figures in the founding generation of the United States during the Revolutionary War, third president of the United States, writer of the Declaration of Independence, rather important figure in many ways. If we look back 100 years, and again, keeping in mind that especially when you're dealing with smaller children, obviously the history you're going to give initially is going to be rather simplified, just by necessity. Children aren't exactly going to be the ones who are going to be able to do nuance terribly well. So if you go back 100 years, when talking about Thomas Jefferson was viewed as America's philosopher. He was one of the, he's a man of many talents, very virtuous, very intelligent, did all of these sort of wonderful things, was an exemplar of the founding generation. And look about, say, in the last 10 years. Generally, if Thomas Jefferson is being discussed, yeah, he was involved with the Declaration of Independence, but oftentimes he's viewed more as a hypocrite. That he was talking about freedom while owning slaves. That yes, he was doing all these various other types of activities, but he was very much locked in and seemed to support the type of racial slavery system that existed. Obviously, these two frames are going to lead to rather different views of what the American system is like and what the American system should be in the future. That's what tends to make this so controversial, because that type of framing matters. And more to the point that it's, especially because it's dealing with children. So like in a college class, so I mean, especially if you've had the joys of taking either Dr. Bounds or Dr. Vandellope's classes in history, and in many of the other classes, there's more sort of discussion during some of these things. That the idea is that yes, you're dealing with adults, you're all adults, you're emotionally and mentally mature, and therefore there can be discussions on whether or not something is right or wrong, better or worse, what's the correct interpretation. Versus if you're dealing with a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old. This isn't a free speech zone. Students don't have the cognitive or emotional maturity to be able to make these sort of distinctions. And moreover, given how a school is set up at that age, you're not involved in a conversation with the teacher. The teacher is telling you what is or what is not, how something is or what it's not. So what those lessons are become fundamentally important because you really are in some ways shaping what the next generation of citizens is going to look like. And this is why they become so controversial. And probably always will be, honestly. Which brings us to the reforming of schools. So especially in the last 25, 30 years, reforming schools has become much more of an issue. Now, one of the big reasons is, so again, late 1800s, early 1900s, public education really starts to develop into what we know it as today in the United States. And with that, you see a pretty substantial increase in literacy rates, mathematical ability, things like that, which you would expect. Better schools, more students going through school, all of this sort of thing. Yeah, you'd expect that this would tend to have a pretty substantial effect on an increasingly educated population. Nifty. Then when we start getting to especially the 80s and 90s, though, things start getting a little more rough. So start seeing sort of plateauing a little bit, and even in some ways these things going down, students being less literate, being less mathematically inclined. Where the idea is, okay, this is a problem, there's something going wrong, and what is the problem? So for those who are focused more on the idea that the problems may be something going on in schools, there have been various suggestions on how to reform them. This include things like school-based management, so more localized control. Additionally, having certain types of specialized schools called magnet schools. So for instance, if there are students who seem to have a particular natural proclivity towards science, you send them to a school that's mostly dedicated to dealing with science. If you have students who seem to have a natural proclivity towards the arts, you send them there. Similarly, if you have students who seem to have certain types of behavioral problems or difficulties, you would send them to a magnet school focused on that. And then also things like charter schools, effectively private schools opening up as a means of sort of opening some competition. Competition bringing us to what's probably the most debated form of reform, this being educational vouchers. The idea with this being that this gives parents greater leeway in terms of deciding what schools their children are going to go to. So again, typically the way it works is what school does a child go to? It's dependent upon what school district the family lives in, and the location within that district in which the student lives. So as an example, when I was growing up, there was a middle school that was about 15 minutes away from my house. But because of where we lived in the school district, where my parents' house was, the middle school I went to was about 30 or 40 minutes away because of just of how the mapping worked for that. That's how it worked. With something like an educational voucher, the idea is, so again, each student on average is getting $12,600 spent on them in the education system. So the idea is that you give that money to the parents, specifically a voucher for that amount, and that they can choose what school their child is going to go to using that money. So if they decide to go to a school that might be even a little more expensive, so especially like a private school or maybe a parochial school, the idea is, okay, if let's say a parochial school costs $15,000 a year. Okay, well, they can use the educational voucher to pay for 12,000 of it, and the parents would cover the other 3. If they're dealing with a public education system, dealing with a public school, the voucher would effectively cover all of it. Meaning that a parent can now choose. They're not limited by where they specifically live in a school district. Now they can send their child to wherever they wish using that voucher as long as the school hasn't gotten filled up. This again has controversy behind it. So teachers' unions, for the most part, tend to be pretty strongly against vouchers. One of their biggest arguments is that this is going to lead to pretty significant inequalities between schools, effectively leading to a tiered system. So we mentioned earlier that sort of a vicious circle that can kind of develop, where, say, a school has less funding, tends to lead to lower quality. Lower quality means that you're going to have more students coming out. It's going to lower the general economic base of that area, kind of again coming into a circle. So the concern with this is that the sort of voucher system would effectively create a tiered system of schools that are very well funded and poor schools that are basically out of luck. And that this is a dynamic that would be highly destructive, is the idea. Moreover, they give some sort of nuts and bolts, sort of detailed issues about, say, just infrastructure problems. So one of the biggest ones being, how are you going to transport these students? So one of the reasons why school districts are based on location the way they are in terms of where students are going is for the school bus system, to make sure that the students can get to school. If students are going everywhere, how are you going to arrange their transportation? Now, there's also a negative side, so we're going to deal with this with both of them. So this is sort of the teachers' unions making their positive case for why they think vouchers is incorrect, but they also can kind of go a little more negative. Specifically arguing that this is kind of 2 things. One, that the support of vouchers is oftentimes based on a desire to harm the poor as well as racial minorities. That the idea with vouchers is that effectively, especially more bigoted sort of individuals or rich people want to try and get their kids away from poor students or from racially different students, with the idea being that this means that poorer students and racial minority students are going to be stuck in the poorer schools. So that this is, even if it's not their intention, this is what's going to happen. But for at least some representatives of teachers' unions, they will say, well, no, this is actually the intention of what's going on. They can also sometimes play on religious prejudices. So the idea being that especially if these vouchers would be used for private schools, parochial schools, so again, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, they argue that, well, this means that effectively state funds are going to be going for bigoted curriculums. So for instance, we'll say something like a Catholic school. I'm Catholic, so I remember going to some Catholic schools when I was a kid. If we're talking about something like sexual morality, the Catholic Church is not really too fond of things like same-sex marriage and that kind of thing. And that's going to be reflected in the education in those schools. For some of the teachers' unions, they'll make arguments that these sort of schools are trying to raise bigots, in effect, which is obviously going rather negative. Proponents for vouchers have reasons for why they support them. The big reason is generally this idea of competition. But the idea is the reason why schools have these sort of problems of quality is because they are government entities. So if you're dealing with private firms, a private firm has to try, a private company, a private business, has to try and improve and keep itself, efficient and working well, or it's going to go out of business. So for instance, if I'm running a coffee shop, I have to try and make sure I'm getting the most I can out of the equipment I have, out of the materials I have, and out of the employees I have. If I don't, there are going to be other coffee shops that people are going to go to. And eventually, if I don't get my act together, I'm going to go out of business. Then the competition basically serves to push for greater efficiency, push for greater quality. The concern with government entities, and so public schools as examples of public entities, public government institutions, is they don't have that competition. So if a school is doing well, yes, they're going to be getting funding and all that. If a school is doing poorly, they're going to keep getting funding. And they're going to keep getting students because effectively you're sort of trapped in a monopoly. Unless someone physically moves from their home to a new home, where they go is dependent upon where the school district tells them to go by law. Indeed, I think there were even a couple of cases in California where because a parent wanted their child to go to a better school, what they would do is they would send their child to live with, say, an aunt or an uncle in a different school district so he could go there, which, as memory serves, one or two parents actually got initially charged with fraud for doing something like that. For those who are in support of vouchers, they say this is a problem, especially if we're dealing with students who are living in poorer areas. This means they're effectively locked into bad schools just because of the dumb luck of where they live, through no fault of their own. And that there's no incentive to make those schools get better. By having vouchers, this creates that incentive. If now all of those parents and students, especially inside poor areas, now have the ability to say, no, I have this voucher. I'm sending my son or daughter to the good school, not the place where there are regular shootings or where the teachers come in drunk or whatever, or what have you. I'm going to send them to another one. That's going to basically force those schools where people are leaving to try and improve themselves. And if they can't improve themselves, in effect, they're going to be closed down. The idea is that this increases accountability and it increases the ability to try and improve. Now, again, just like with teachers' unions, these proponents also have their negative sort of argument. Their big argument is that effectively teachers' unions are trying to actively prevent accountability in schools and basically kind of keep a coercive monopoly on education. Because the idea is that if teachers actually have the choice of removing their students from bad schools, this is going to expose failing schools and the teachers, which is going to generally lead to, say, cutting of teachers, cutting of schools, which will undercut the interests of the unions as well as the amount of member students they're getting. So, say an example of where this comes up is, well, say New York. There was a documentary a couple of years ago talking about some of the dysfunctions in the New York City public education system. And one of the dysfunctions is that it is incredibly hard to fire a teacher. So one of the things they mentioned was what were called rubber rooms. And what it would mean is that a teacher would be sent to this particular building inside the city of New York, And basically they would spend 8 hours just playing cards or reading or doing whatever. Because these were teachers who were, say, drunk in class or involved in highly inappropriate relationships with their students or something of this type. Trying to fire one of these teachers is an expensive and extended type of procedure. So what the school district would do is they would just assign them to this building. They'd still get their pay. They're still being paid as teachers, but just basically to keep them out of the schools so they're not causing more trouble. The idea is that this negative sort of argument, the idea is this is the fault of what teacher unions have done, what basically made teachers unaccountable. So vouchers being a way to remedy that is the argument. So what we've been focusing on so far is primary and secondary education. And again, in the United States, generally speaking, you are required as a child, unless there are unique exceptions. The expectation is that a child is going to be has to attend school at least until the age of 16. So they're not required to graduate from high school, but they need to be attending school until at least the age of 16. And starting at the age of, this is the one problem without having kids, because ages become a blur in terms of when students start things and this, that, and the other. But I guess, starting at like maybe age 5 or 6 or whatever it is. This is where I really need to talk to some of my friends to find out that day. Anyway, now we're going to move to higher education, to college, to the tertiary level. Now, you have plenty of private colleges, although they are still getting oftentimes a great deal of federal funding, something we'll talk about in a moment. But you also have an extended number of state universities. So Texas A&M is a state university. The University of Illinois system, state universities. Ohio State, things of this type. Now, for a large number of them, they started out as land grant colleges. So this is where the United States government, especially states as territories were moving into being states, were basically dedicating certain areas of land for the specific purpose of having higher education institutions. Especially, say, in the period of the mid-1800s, focused on things like agriculture or mechanics. So Texas A&M, agricultural and mechanical, or agricultural and metallurgy, I can never remember which one. Texas A&M originated as a land grant college as its initial purpose. Now, the number of people going to college in the United States has exploded in the period following the Second World War. It was already starting to increase somewhat before then, but there was a massive increase in the number of people who went to college and to the university after World War II. And there are a few reasons for this. One of the big initial reasons was the GI Bill. So one of the problems that again can arise after a war is that you have a large population of people well trained in killing who now need jobs. Now again, the United States kind of had a unique, kind of lucked out after the Second World War as being the one economy that didn't get wrecked during that war, so it was already in pretty good condition. So along with, say, being in a pretty good condition economically, but also wanting to try and ease in the integration of these various soldiers who are coming back from war, as well as try and increase the education level of the citizenry, Congress passes the GI Bill, which basically says that if you have been in the military for a certain amount of time, the United States government will pay for a certain amount, maybe even all of your college education. So for many of us, we can, especially at a certain age, we'll have aunts, uncles, grandparents who became the first in their family to go to college based on the GI Bill. Increased level of wealth generally in the US also tended to increase the number of people going to college. As we get into, say, like the 1960s and so forth, another reason why college, a number of people in college increased was because of the Vietnam War. So, and the internet connection has gone unstable. Hopefully you all are still seeing this. Because one of the big things with that is the Vietnam War tended to become increasingly unpopular. At this time, there was the draft or conscription. So if you were an adult male at the, as soon as you turned 18, you had to go into the selective service system, which basically meant that, and I mean, even to this day. So when I turned 18, still had to sign up with the selective service system, which means that basically there's a random lottery, and if your number comes up, you have to join the military for a certain amount of time. That was in existence during the Vietnam War. But you can get deferments. So basically something that says, okay, even if your number's called up, you don't have to serve right now. One of the biggest deferments was, are you going to college? So a lot of young guys especially went to college specifically to avoid getting drafted, which also has certain effects on how the university system developed at that point. Then finally, one other major thing that kind of shifts more toward people going more towards college is that previously, oftentimes various businesses or companies would have tests. So if you're trying to get hired, along with, say, showing your resume, talking about your education, so on and so forth, they'd have you do some sort of test to show that you were competent in something. As time has gone on, as these have gone through the courts, there was an increasing tendency for the courts to say that certain types of tests might be discriminatory in nature. Even if they weren't necessarily intended to be discriminatory, they might be in practice. That being the case, what many companies did to avoid questions of legality or to avoid liability in something like a lawsuit or a civil case is they started using college degrees as a proxy. Or in other words, basically the idea being, okay, we can't give you a test, but if you've managed to get a college degree, presumably you have the skills and abilities that we need. This leading to a substantially larger number of people going to college in the United States, and with a significant number graduating. Although, I think currently of those who go to college, about 60% graduate, maybe a little bit less. So this kind of varies over time. Now, there have also been issues as this has gone on. So especially in the last 30 years, the big issue has been the cost of education. So the cost of tuition in US colleges has increased at a much higher rate than inflation of the last 30 or 40 years. And yet at the same time, colleges are still running out of money, or oftentimes say that they're running short on funds. How is this happening? One is just simply because you have larger infrastructure costs. So especially, and this kind of connects to the second, that you have a larger number of students. If you have a larger number of students, you're going to need more dormitories, you're going to need more classroom space, you're going to need more professors, you're going to need more of all these sorts of things. So it just increases the cost as it goes on. But also say what students expect. So for instance, when I was going to college many an eon ago, and going to the dorm rooms, to me they seemed pretty simple, pretty Spartan, not terribly fancy. But it was funny seeing my parents go in because they're looking at it going, wow, this is a really fancy dorm room they give you guys. That's really impressive. And them talking about that, yeah, back when they were in college, the dorms were very, very sparse. From the last time I visited a university dorm in the United States a couple of years ago, I understood what my parents were talking about because I walked into the dorm going, oh my gosh, look how fancy this is. It looks so comfortable, it looks so nice. So obviously, say also what students are expecting, and more importantly, what parents are expecting has tended to increase as time goes on, which also increases the cost. One other issue that comes up is just the number of administrators. So people who aren't faculty, who aren't students, but say the various types of staff. The number of administrators in universities has increased exponentially over time. So after 2005, the number of administrators generally outnumbered the number of teaching staff in any given university, sometimes by particularly severe amounts. And this happens even at private universities. There was a news story recently out of Yale University, one of the top private universities in the United States. Yale has 6,000 students and it has 5,000 administrators, so almost a 1-to-1 ratio, which is pretty severe. So that adds additional costs as well. What tends to become controversial with some of this as well, because again, kind of like with secondary and primary education, the issue of measurement comes up. Okay, if all of this money is being spent, what are we getting out of it? And this is where you see kind of a pretty significant difference between, say, universities and especially faculty versus, say, what parents and lawmakers and taxpayers are expecting from measurement. So if you're at a major research university, so Texas A&M, College Station, let's use that as an example. And let's say you're a professor. You're starting out and you want to get promoted. You want to get tenure. You want to become an associate professor. You want to do that. The measurements that are generally going to be used for you are things like, how many publications do you have? How many articles have you written? How many books have you written? How much in research grants have you gotten? Now, especially for like the engineers or some of the scientists, but especially the engineers, this comes up. So, how many grants have you received? How many multiple millions of dollars have you gotten? Things of that type. That's the main measurement. While teaching is kind of secondary, to put it mildly. So again, let's take this hypothetical faculty member in College Station. If they are the greatest professor ever in terms of teaching, students just love them to death, professor's done excellent for that, but he's not published anything, that professor is not going to get promoted. That professor after 6 or 7 years is going to be told, thank you for your time, go away. On the other hand, if this professor, say, had multiple grants coming in from major institutions, has $50 million worth of research grant money coming in, has multiple publications, multiple patents, but as a teacher is pretty much absent and most of the students can't stand him and don't really get much out of it, that professor is probably still going to get tenure. They're probably still going to get promoted. Obviously, this is in pretty big contrast to say what parents and taxpayers and lawmakers want. The idea is, okay, the purpose of a university is we want an educated population. We want people coming out who know what they're talking about. We want professors who are engaged with their students, while things like publications and grants tend to be a little more secondary, especially if you're getting outside of the physical sciences or engineering. So again, you kind of have a contrast or a conflict over what kind of measurements should count. And this can come up frequently. One final issue that's a matter of importance is the issue of student debt. So the way it works in the United States is the national government subsidizes certain forms of student loans. So what that means is that if a bank gives a loan to a student and that student isn't able to pay it back, the national government is going to pay that bank the amount of the loan. So the idea is for a bank, there's nothing really to lose. You're going to get your money back one way or the other. The reason for this is because, especially for a bank, they're looking at credit ratings. They want to see if someone's going to likely be able to pay back a loan. No offense, because it's applied to me as well when I was younger. If you're an 18-year-old, most banks are going to say, okay, you're a pretty big credit risk. We don't know if this is really worthwhile. Thus, why the national government subsidizes this. But there's some problems that arise with this. The first is a kind of vicious cycle, because universities are also familiar with student aid and loans that come in. So if the national government says, okay, we are going to subsidize loans up to $12,000 for a year in terms of tuition, universities will say, okay, well, we'll make our tuition $15,000 then, because they'll still cover most of them, get a little bit more. After time goes on for a while, the national government will say, okay, well, we'll subsidize to $15,000. The university's rates is $18,000. Again and again and again. Do this for about 20 or 30 years, and now you have rather large tuition costs. That in itself is a problem. But the bigger issue is that now you have situations with university graduates who can't find work. So previously, the idea was that if you graduated from college, it was kind of your ticket into a good job and to a middle-class lifestyle in the United States. That has changed. So you have many people who are university graduates who can't find work or can't find work at the level that they would hope. So they might be able to get a job as, say, like a barista or something, a job they could have gotten without a college degree. But with the addition that they're tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And one of the big problems with this is a subsidized student loan. You can't erase that through bankruptcy. That loan amount stays with you for good. That's kind of one of the downsides of having the national government subsidizing it, is governments tend to really like getting their money back. So as a comparison, so we talked about bankruptcy law somewhat at the early part of the class. In this sort of case, let's say I have $30,000 worth of credit card debt and I go bankrupt. So I go to bankruptcy court, we figure out the arrangements on that, but once bankruptcy's been declared and we go through all that, then $30,000 is wiped out. I no longer have that debt. Versus if I have $30,000 worth of student loan debt and I go bankrupt. Yes, we're getting all these sort of things together, but that $30,000 of student loan debt still remains. That's not going to get removed. Now, admittedly, there are oftentimes systems where if you're not getting paid enough, if you don't have much of a salary, it decreases the amount you have to pay in any given month, or maybe even removes it for a while. But you're still on the hook for paying it eventually. So this creates a situation where you have a large number of graduates who are kind of in debt servitude, in a sense, that they can't get better work, better jobs, and they have a large amount of debt. That can present many social problems. Thankfully, the United States isn't in that sort of situation yet, but if one looks at other countries and other parts of history, one of the things that tends to lead to great levels of instability, especially sort of more radical changes, is if you have a highly credentialed or educated part of the population that can't find the work it thinks it deserves. It tends to mean that they become very resentful against the system, and that they tend to have some skills that would make them very adept at rather radical and unpleasant changes. Not really something you want to do. So it can be destabilizing. Another thing that this has caused for its social ramifications is more of a focus on skilled trades. So you're now seeing more of a focus on people saying, well, we should be encouraging students not to just all go to college, because that's usually been a big push for the last 40 years, but instead encourage students to look at things like becoming electricians, becoming welders, becoming air conditioning unit maintenance people. Because the idea is that you have much less debt, maybe no debt at all, and indeed, they're going to have more employment opportunities. That, in effect, the idea is the nation is always going to need electricians. Don't mean to speak wrong against my discipline, but the country is always going to need electricians and mechanics. They're not going to always need political scientists. So it kind of encourages this sort of change. And that brings us to the end of this. Wow, we managed to get through all of it. Groovy. Excellent. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we'll see if there are any sort of questions or things of that